Okay, good morning and welcome to this talk. My name is Claudio Spac and I'll quickly go over log analytics, what, why, and how to actually do it. It's surprisingly simple, and if you're not already doing something similar, you're just missing out on a lot of data, a lot of information, especially about how your application is actually performing. So, quick introduction. I'm currently a tech lead at Wayfair. I started working in 2014, so 9.5-ish years of experience with Progress. In the meantime, I've just worked on several projects. Yeah, unluckily so far, I never had one where logs were, properly processed and parsed and all of that. So looking forward to that in the future. Now, quick things about Wayfair. 10 plus years of experience, a lot in Progress technologies, some web technologies, cloud. Basically, if you're interested in something, feel free to find us. There's a booth just, to the right and all the way at the end. We have a booth there. Go pick up a pen, a notebook or something. And yeah, now into the meat of things. So, in terms of issues, if you're not doing logs right, you're just kind of looking at a set and forget kind of thing. You start writing whatever comes to mind in the log files. It adds up. It's maybe useful, maybe not, but no one really looks at it anyway, so there's no real expectation that whatever you're logging is going to be particularly great. Then you're never stored or processed, so if you want to see what logging you had 2 weeks ago, either someone has that, maybe it's archived somewhere and you have to look for it, or it's just gone and you're kind of out of luck and you have to figure everything out without logs. Then the process part, even if your logs are bad, like really bad, you can still gain a lot of info just by parsing it and looking for things that make sense inside of your application. Again, hard to go through. If it's just done so it's there, whoever logs things is going to log whatever they feel like it, so you might end up with 10 yes and no fields, no info about what's actually getting logged. So that's always fun to find, because you then have to read logs with the code side by side and constantly keep going through one. What else? Again, not very useful. You're not logging anything right. You're not doing it in the right order. It's just going to be hard to go through, and at that point, people are just not going to bother going through your logs because it just takes a lot of time and effort to gain anything useful out of it. Now, in terms of content, some brief things about logging, how it should be done, ideally, not long on here because it's not really about logging. Some of the common pitfalls you're gonna find, and then finally the log analytics part, how to get it set up and how easy it is. Okay, so why do you want logging? You need to figure out what's happening in your application. Are you getting a bunch of errors because something's misconfigured? Is someone running 10 million requests at the same time just for the kicks of it? You need to have some idea of what's happening, who's doing it, even why they're doing it. Then you finally want to know when it happened. It's not really useful to know that, okay, we had an outage, we had some issues sometime last Tuesday. You're going to want to know the hour so you can use that info to maybe cross-check some other things, like are you getting a lot of system errors or something like that? Is one of your disks failing? And you're going to want to know how it happened. This is more around the context in the log. If you've got enough info, you're going to be able to quickly figure out what's actually happening. Now, in terms of requirements, you're going to want log messages to be ordered. Generally, that's just going to be, by time. It's probably enough, but if you've got a lot of processes writing to the same file, you're also going to want to, group it by the request or something that makes sense for you, because otherwise it's going to be pretty much impossible to read if you've got one line from this process and then 10 lines from a different one, all, interspersed together. It's going to be a pain. Then you want it to be configurable. So this depends on how deep you want to go, but at least you're going to want to be able to set the log level. You're not really always going to want to have 10 million log lines for every single request. Maybe you're not all that interested in the verbose logging somewhere at the framework level or similar things. So you want to be able to set a log level in some point that makes sense in your configuration. and only get log messages you're actually going to be interested in. Then you should be able to configure the metadata that gets output for every single log line. So if you're using the log manager, there's already going to be something. So timestamp, the agent, the process, the thread, all of that. And you're going to want to add some more info that's specific to your application, so you can better attribute log lines to some user or some action. In terms of configurable logging, there's an OpenEdge logging framework. It's been here since 2016, I think. There was a talk yesterday about it, so yeah, it's really useful. You're going to be able to set up things so you're not necessarily going to be logging to a file. You take the log message, send it over to some API endpoint, and that way you get rid of disk I/O if that's going to be an issue for you, depending on how much you log. Finally, they should be easily readable. So again, if you have a string of 10 yes, no's, it's not really useful. There's various formats used in logging, some of them better than others. Generally speaking, if you're doing something really weird, you shouldn't be doing that. There's essentially log format that's essentially a list of key equals value and all of that to the end of the string. That's a pretty commonly used one. The other option is to just use a JSON object where you can pack whatever information you want, the log message itself, and that's going to make it a lot easier to go through. So in the example I have in a few slides, the config essentially boils down to, here's the regex that goes off into the distance, and that's going to extract things from the log file. But if you don't have to do that, it's just a lot easier to change your logging format to something more used. Now, how you're going to do it? Well, initially we had message input statements, kind of placed wherever in the code, made sense, and it worked. You can output to a specific file. You can use the log manager, and then the OpenEdge logging framework I mentioned that should be really interesting to go through. But in the end, the idea is you get some kind of message, you output it somewhere, and that's logging. Now, in terms of common pitfalls, if you have no set format, this means some lines look one way, some lines look another way. If you're changing, for example, the timestamp format for whatever reason, that's just going to be a huge issue. If some lines have some metadata and some lines don't, and you're not using a proper format, again, that's going to be an issue to parse. So try to set a standard and just follow that throughout your application. It's going to make everything just a lot easier. Then multiple formats. I mean, if you've got multiple applications and maybe they were developed separately, that would be a reason why you'd end up in a situation like this, where you're going to be interested in logs from both, but they're just going to be different in terms of format. So again, here's where things like the actual format of the logging comes in. Log format, JSON, all of those are easily parsable, so you can just move through those, especially if you've got only one place where the logging is done. Change that one spot, and you're good to go everywhere else. Then there's no configurable log level, and depending how far you want to take it, no configurable place where the logs are coming from. It's useful to have a bunch of data, but too much data can be an issue as well. It's just going to clutter things up. So if you're interested in, there's this one particular file where we want to have some more detailed logging. Ideally, you want to be able to configure that and have it take effect instantly. Then there's the bad output part. This is where people don't take care of what they're logging. So you write some code, you write some logs for it. It's kind of okay at that point. Someone else makes some changes, and the log loses meaning. You're essentially logging bad data. Maybe it's going to yell at you that some table isn't there, or some variable value is just going to be way off because it's in the wrong place. You need to just clean things up and make sure that whatever you're logging is an actual real value, not just some mistake left behind. At that point, it's just a bug in your data. Then logging as an afterthought. If you do logging all the way at the end, you have a feature and you decide, okay, maybe I should add some logging around it. Chances are you're just going to log whatever comes to mind. You're not going to pick up the really interesting pieces of data. And this is just going to be one of those things that gets done and no one looks at it, and then it's essentially useless. Now, for log analytics and some just very simple requirements, you want it to be automated. You don't want someone to have to copy files from one place to another so they get picked up by analytics. It should be able to handle multiple formats and sources. And yeah, again, it's a good thing to handle them. It's not the greatest if you have your application set up that way, but it's doable and it helps with some situations. Then you're going to want things to be real time. You don't necessarily want to have to wait for 30 minutes to figure out how things were 5 minutes ago. Then you need to look at past data. That's, again, something that's really useful. You want to know how your CPU usage affects, the latency of a request or something similar. And you want to be able to compare that with the same data, 2 weeks ago or before release went out or something similar. So having some past data is going to be great. Then, you got your logs, and you're going to want to extract some additional info from them. Even if you're not the best, you can still look for things and extract data out of those. So for example, if in your log file, you're outputting how long some process took. When you parse that line, you're going to be able to extract that particular bit of info and create a metric based on it. That way, you're always going to be able to go in your data and, check the request duration for the past week or something. Next, they should be easy to search. If you're going to be logging from different apps, from a bunch of different machines, the logs are going to get huge pretty fast. So you're going to want to be able to easily search through everything you've got. Now, in terms of tools, if it's just logging, you've got a bunch of options. Just search on Google Log Analytics and you're going to get a list of 30 options you can use, and then there's going to be a lot more tools for application performance monitoring that tie into all of this. So if you want to use it, do a bit of research to make sure that what you're picking is actually going to be a good fit for your project, and then you should be able to get started. Now, in terms of common setups, you can self-host all of this. It's going to take a bit of know-how, getting Docker set up, getting Kubernetes if you're doing any kind of scale. So you're going to have to spend some time on that, maybe get some gray hairs because YAML isn't the greatest config language that ever was. Or you can just go cloud-based. I'm pretty sure everyone's going to be offering their own hosted infrastructure. And yeah, this is what we're going to be using for this. It's going to be Grafana and just the free tier, but it's really easy to get started, even if you know nothing about Docker and how it's all supposed to play together. Okay, so what we're going to be doing is Grafana for centralized analysis. You're going to be, putting your logs up on Loki, your metrics in Prometheus, any other kind of data sources that it supports. You're going to be able to pull info from all of those, query through it, and create a proper dashboard with some nice graphs telling you how things progress over time, how many errors you've got in the last 5 minutes, and things like that. It supports OpenTelemetry, so that's going to be useful. There was a talk yesterday, so if you're running 12.2 or later, you're going to be able to get some nice metrics for your databases, your past instances, and you can just tie all of this into Grafana so you've got the data available as well. I think it's just OpenEdge Command Center agent and then some brief setup to tie it all together. I think there's going to be some articles up somewhere about this, so it should be easy to find. Now, we're using Grafana Loki for log aggregation, and we're going to build metrics from logs, as we mentioned, with things like how long each request took. And you're going to be able to look at a real-time tail of your logs. Now, Prometheus and Mimir for metrics and the actual storage. You've got the talk yesterday about OpenTelemetry for OpenEdge. And then we've got one today about OpenTelemetry and Room 531. Now, in terms of initial setup, you're going to want an application that's going to write out some logs. You're going to need a bit of time to figure everything out and see what you're going to be interested in. And then if you want to use the cloud offering, an email address. But yeah, I suppose people already have that. Now, what we're going to be doing for the ingest part. We're going to be using Promptail. It also supports multiple sources. So other than just plain log files, there's going to be some specific things for Windows event. If you're using Linux, journal logs, all of that, it's all supported. It's going to support some data transformation. So you read the log file in, you're going to be able to, regex, or if it's JSON, there's a stage for that. And based on whatever's in the log file, you're going to be able to create some new pieces of data alongside it. I'll skip over the config because it makes more sense to go over it in a bit. But yeah, here's some of the other stages. Docker, that just supports the standard format in which Docker logs things. JSON, which just breaks up a JSON object into a list of properties. Templates, that's similar to Golang's templates. I have no idea how it actually works, but it does, and someone's going to be using it. And then a match stage where you can, tell it if this thing is happening, if there's this piece of text in the log line, you do all of the other stuff. It's going to be used for metrics, so we're going to be looking for some piece of text, and based on that, updating metrics. Now, your metrics, if you want to do it for the system, it's going to depend on the operating system you're using. Whether or not you're using Docker is another thing. But the key point here is pretty much all of those are supported, and it's going to be easy to set up. And that's great info, because if you're able to correlate between what your hardware is doing and what your application is doing, you might be able to find some interesting things. So in the talk yesterday, there was an issue when migrating to PASS in terms of having some small memory leaks that quickly added up and just brought everything to a halt. So with something like this, you're going to be able to see how your memory is doing and if you've got any issues there. Now, config again depends on the tool. We're going to be using something really simple for my laptop, Windows Exporter. It's just going to, grab a bunch of metrics on whatever's happening with your memory, your CPU, your disks, and just upload that. I think services as well, but I've got way too many of those, so I just disabled it. In terms of config, you're obviously going to be able to set everything up, but yeah, I've just got a really simple one where I'm essentially telling it, okay, so I'm interested in these categories, and start the process somewhere and forget about it. For the exporting part, we're going to be using Prometheus. And Prometheus is essentially going to be given a list of metric endpoints. It's going to go through those every so often, and after that, it's going to push it all to the cloud to the store, so it's actually used. Again, various metrics providers, you're going to have a lot of options. So if you've already got some services that you're running or some sort of open source application, chances are it's already going to have its own metrics endpoint. So similar to how we have the OpenEdge Command Center agent, there's a chance some other services are going to have their own metrics endpoint. And it's just going to be easy to plug that into, so you've got some more info on what's happening. Now, it's easy to set up, so I'll skip over this as well. And now I'll just go into the setup and briefly go over it. Where am I going here? So I've got, the containers running with Docker Compose. We're just going to start a Prometheus, some volumes. This is going to be the config file that gets sent to it. Yeah, that's a really good point. My bad. Yeah, kind of forgot about that. Okay, is the text fine or? Okay, wait, now I'm not seeing my screen. Just a second. Okay, so Docker Compose, that's just going to start the containers we're going to be using. Prometheus to look at those metric endpoints and push all the info out. We're just passing in a config file, using some volumes and all that. It's just fairly simple and exposing a port. Not a lot of config here. Obviously, if you're going to be doing this at scale, if you're running your application in Kubernetes, you're going to be interested in having all of this be secure, be working nicely, be available 24/7. So this config isn't going to work for that. You're going to need to do a bit more work. But for demo purposes, it's fairly easy, and that way you can quickly check if while you're doing this, if you're going to be interested in doing something similar for your own app or projects. Next, another PromTail container. This time we're going to be going through logs. Similarly, it just has its own config file it's going to use, and that's it. Now I've got another PromTail one that's commented out, and here I was trying to do something weird. I'll go over it towards the end because it makes more sense that way. But yeah, I was trying to use logs to create metrics instead of creating a proper metrics endpoint, and it's doable, but not the best idea. Okay, now for the actual config. So Prometheus first, because it's very simple. On a global level, how often do you want to scrape for logs? In this case, it's 15 seconds. Depending on what tier you're buying, you're going to be limited to some extent about the amount of data you can send and how often you can do it. But yeah, feel free to play along with this and find something that works for you. We're also going to be adding an external label to the metrics we're going to be sending over. In this case, it's telling it it's a monitor, dev monitor. Then in scrape configs. So we're just going to be, running this dev monitor job every 15 seconds. And it's going to be looking at these couple of metrics endpoints where it's going to grab the data from. Next, there's the remote write section where we're essentially telling it, push all the metrics you're grabbing to, this Prometheus endpoint, and you've got the start of an auth token there and username. But that's it in terms of Prometheus. It's fairly simple. PromTail is going to be slightly more involved depending on what you're trying to achieve. So the server port, in this case, the metrics are going to be available at an endpoint running on port 9080. The positions file is something that PromTail uses to know where it is in the file. So if it's reading through a log file and halfway through the process dies, it's going to know where it should pick up again afterwards. Otherwise, it's just going to try to keep sending duplicate logs over. In terms of the client, it's again half of my API token pointing to a specific Loki endpoint. Then scrape configs again, a job name, in which case it's dev correct because I had another dev one which I kind of broke at some point. And yeah, we're just looking for files on our local machine. We give it under labels the path where it's supposed to look for logs. So this is the volume that just gets mounted in the container, and we're just going to be looking for web, client, server logs. You can specify the labels you want to include. So in this case, we're just giving it an environment. But most of your labels are probably going to come from the actual contents of the log file. And there's a bit of a thing to mention here about labels. So one thing that Loki does somewhat differently is that it's not going to index the entire log line. So you're not going to be able to immediately look for this piece of string. You're going to want to sort it, narrow it down by labels. And in terms of what can be used as a label, you're pretty much free to pick whatever you want. The caveat here is that if you're using something as a label, so something like a session ID, that changes every single time someone logs in, that's not a good label because you're going to have unique values essentially, and it's just going to start slowing things down because what Loki does, it splits up logs into streams. So you're going to have a set of labels, and then those labels are going to have some associated log lines with them. And if you've got a bunch of labels that have unique values, the amount of streams is just going to keep adding up. So the ideal thing is you're going to want labels with limited values. So, I'll go to a bit of a problematic one. So for example, the process. It's interesting. You're maybe going to want to have it. It's a bit of a mess because if you're running, multiple machines and logging from all of those, the process might be the same, the process ID. But it's an example of a value that's sort of unique, but it's at least bound. So you're only going to have so many different process IDs. You're not going to, keep increasing that list off into infinity. And the other ones are fairly simple, and they're, again, just going to be limited in scope. Okay, now, in terms of timestamp, Log Manager writes its own timestamp in some particular format. That's how you configure things. So, Promptail is going to look at your log file. It's going to grab the log timestamp based on that nice regex that goes into the distance that splits up the log line into the data pieces, I guess. But yeah, it's going to go through this format, and then you're not going to have a timestamp that's telling you when Promptail ingested that log line. It's going to be the timestamp of the log line itself. Now we get into some match stuff, and we're using this for metrics. So in this case, it's trying to match, and in terms of selector, it's telling you that the client type is going to be web speed. That's essentially select everything in this case, but you can narrow things down further depending on what you're actually doing with the log lines. Next, if it processes a log line that's coming over with a client type of web speed, it's going to try to go through this regex, and it's essentially looking for this piece of text that's telling it routine action, sub action being set to some values. And, okay, what am I doing wrong? Yeah, and again, regex, it's going to get parsed into some values, and you can use those later on. The source itself is going to be the message text all the way at the end of that huge regex. Is, you've got whatever metadata you're going to be outputting, and the log message at the end, and that's the message text in this case. Now, when you get that, we're going to be adding some new labels to that log line, the routine action and sub action, and we're also going to be interested in creating some metrics based on that. So in this case, it's just going to be a simple counter. Every single time, you get a log line that's telling you what's happening, you increment that particular counter, and it's going to have the associated routine action and sub action labels. At that point, you're going to be able to quickly query over it. So if you're interested in one particular routine, you can look at this metric, pass it in the routine you want to, get some info from, and you're essentially going to be done. It's going to be a lot clearer when there's the actual Grafana demo towards the end. But until then, just trust me, it's going to be really easy to use. Okay, so metadata about the actual metric, the type, description, a prefix that you can set, and the max idle duration. This is essentially there so you don't keep cluttering things up. So if a metric isn't getting data in 24 hours, it's going to be removed. Again, performance reasons, feel free to increase this if it makes sense for your application. But yeah, fairly bare bones setup. Another match statement, similar things. In this case, we're just going to be counting the number of requests coming in. It's done in the wrong place because it's looking at the server logs. It should probably be looking at the broker or something similar, but yeah, we look for that particular bit of text that's telling you the request started at some time. And whenever we get to a line like that, we increment this metrics counter. And again, similar setup to the other one. Finally, we're extracting how long a certain request took to process from a log line. Regex, okay, and create a metric for it. And this time it's not going to be a counter, it's going to be a histogram, and it's going to be going into different buckets depending on how long the request took. I'll briefly open up this Promptail event one. It's not really working, but the idea is that Yeah, so I've got an event running that just uses the VST for table stats, and it's going to output to a log file how many reads, creates, all of that were happening for a table. And I was trying to use this to create some metrics. And I know it's doable because, you know, it's a log file. You write to it and then you can use it, but something's wrong with my config somewhere. I was doing this kind of recently, so it's not really working right now, but the idea is, you know, the similar kind of metrics you're going to get through command center. If you want to do it yourself, you can, you know, quite easily either write something to a log file, which is kind of bad, or create your metrics endpoint, which would be the better idea. But, you know, you've got the VSTs available. You can just grab some info from there in the meantime until, you know, the number of metrics available through the command center increases. Okay, I think this is it in terms of config here. Fairly simple. You're going to be able to create something similar quite quickly, and you're going to get some nice info out of it. Okay. Now, where were we? So far we're just parsing our logs. We're creating different labels based on what we have in them. We're sending it off to the cloud on Loki. And we also create some metrics based on logs. The examples here were, you know, fairly trivial, but you can create some really interesting things specific to your own application. So if you're an e-commerce platform, you can check the number of receipts people start. You can check how many of them actually go to completion, like properly paid and everything's done. You can just do a lot of interesting things. You just need to think a bit about your application and what you're going to want to have some reports on. And you can most likely do all of this through what you're already logging. And if not, you know, the changes needed to get something done are fairly trivial. Okay, then we've also got system metrics. Again, you can correlate what's happening in your hardware with what's happening in your application, and, you know, narrow down some of the issues you might be hitting. Again, metrics collected and sent into the cloud, and everything's going to be working. Now we got Grafana, where we're going to be using all of that data to create some visualizations that are easily, I don't know, not really readable, but you can tell at a glance what's happening. So it's extremely configurable. This is probably going to be an issue as you're getting started with it, because, you know, you're not going to be familiar with how everything works. But you can do a lot of things with it, and it's going to be really great when you're going to have that one specific use case you can do through some obscure piece of configuration. It uses LogQL for its queries. It's well documented, so you shouldn't be running into a lot of issues here. But again, it's fairly simple to use. It's just nice. Then you've got dashboards available for common metrics providers. In this case, it's going to be the system metrics, but for things like the OpenEdge Command Center, they're going to have their own dashboard. I'm sure it's up somewhere. I couldn't find it right now, but yeah, you can essentially import that, and you're going to have whatever, you know, dashboard they had, and it's a nice place to get started. Again, it'll take a while to get used to if you haven't used it before, but once you get started and used to the benefits, it's going to be quite hard to go back to, you know, not having any kind of analytics and just leaving logs be as they were. Now we've got the demo again for Grafana, and let's see if this is going to work. Wait just a second, because it's going to... Just a second. I'm just going to change the display settings so it's mirroring things. Okay. Okay, now to Grafana stuff. So, this is the dashboard that you have available for Windows Exporter. So, Again, a bunch of info. It's easy to see what's happening. So all the way at the top, you've got some variables you can set up for each dashboard. You can leave some values so the user can enter some particular string and you're going to be using that in your queries later on. Or in this case, it's just grabbing the values for particular labels. You're not going to have a lot here, but the dev monitor was set up as the job. It's going to be available here, and you're going to be able to select it, and all the queries later on are just going to use the variable you set here. Similarly, the range you want to report things on, in this case it's the last hour, and that's perfectly fine. And then you're free to pick and choose from any of these charts. So I'll just open up the CPU usage, for example. Come on. My touchpad's not picking up clicks for some reason. It's telling me it's deprecated, but that's perfectly fine. Yeah, it's a time series. It's going to be using the Prometheus data source. So by default, since I've set this up to use the cloud thing, they already have all the data sources imported. But if you want to add your own, it's trivial. I'll go over that in a bit. But it's going to look at this data source, and then it's going to grab some of those metrics, the CPU time total, and here you've got a job that matches the job you set up at the top through those variables. You want to see, it's essentially math at this point, and math that I didn't write, so it's particularly hard to explain. But the idea is you're going to be able to see the CPU usage by instance. So the by part is this bit, and it's, okay, so from 100%, it removes all of the idle time, and then it's averaging it by the instance. So in this case, it's going to be my laptop, but if you have multiple servers, you're going to be able to select one of them, more of them, and you're going to see all of this. Okay. Again, it's a nice, easy starting point. You didn't have to really figure anything out. It's already available, so you can just start using it. And yeah, a bunch of stuff. Memory, CPU usage, network, disk I/O. It also exports metrics on services. That's not in here. You're going to have to write your own, but yeah. Once you have the data available, it's an easy place to be in. Okay, so now, based on the things we were doing for that application all the way in Promtail in terms of config, I'll just open up a dashboard for it and go through some of this stuff we're doing there. Come on. It's called test dash, which is a nice dashboard name. It's using data from the last hour, which unfortunately I wasn't using the application at that time, so it's going to find nothing. I think this is it. Okay, so this is one of those issues. So I've got these top 10 routines over an hour, over the last minute, over 5 minutes. The problem is I have them all set up, so it's doing this over the last hour. And in the last hour, I was essentially here, so there's nothing to report on. I'll set it up so it's doing something differently in a bit, I hope, and then we can see how it looks like. But the idea is fairly simple. We have that dev routine thing, that routine use metric we were exporting. We can, grab all that metric data for the dev correct environment, and for the interface type we select on top. In our case, it's just going to be one or two options. It's just one because of, the time range we're using. But the idea is you grab that metric for the last hour. You see how much it increased, and that's essentially going to tell you that, this routine was used another 5 times this last hour. Then we're summing all of that up by routine. That way it's going to be, grouped up nicely. So you're going to have this routine was used this many times, this routine was used this many times. And finally, we're interested in just the top 10 of those. and we're not going to be looking at, zero values. So if you've only got 5, you've only got 5. You don't want to have, a bunch of blank spaces in there. And that's how easy it is to set things up. I'll go back and try to figure out how I can do this properly. I think it's... Yeah, so this is just a variable that's available, and it's going to be using the range we set on the dashboard at the top instead of, that hard-coded 1 hour. And yeah, now you can get a bunch of info out of it. Session checks, the one used the most, it's essentially idling and just checking that I'm not being logged off by some other process. Some next-gen pattern that's just doing things for a bunch of items. And then all of the colors in here, you can set this up on a per graph basis, and it's essentially thresholds. If it goes over this much, use this color. That way you can, if you've got some, standards that you're trying to keep to, you can do something like this to get an easy idea. And this is just how easy it is to add. Just add a threshold, and, everything over 200 is going to be colored in a nice blue. Yeah. Again, fairly simple, easy to see at a glance what's happening. The color part's a work in progress. It's not really possible to right now dynamically assign different colors. In situations like this, you have to do it one by one, and that's just not a use case that's suitable for something like this, where the number of routines just goes up and up. But yeah, a nice simple bar chart tell you how often some piece of your application is used. Probably save this as well. Okay, now for things like requests per minutes. This is a fairly simple one. Is this using? No. So this one's going to be using the log files. It's not the greatest since we already have that different metric that's telling us how many requests we were processing. But yeah, if you've got something you're going to be interested in at some point in time, you can just go to your log files. And in this case, it's going to count the number of log lines for web speed that have this request started at string in them over the last minute. And it's summing it by interface type, so it's split into these two. And now you've got some info on the number of requests you're parsing. Now imagine this is something different in your app you weren't really interested in before, but now you are. You can just quickly parse your log files to get essentially metrics out of it without any kind of, beforehand config. You'll notice that this looks kind of weird where you've got, some blank spaces. There's an option in here towards the end where you can essentially tell it what value to use if it's got blank. So in this case, if we set this to 0, it's going to be a nice continuous line. So this depends on how you want it to look, but yeah, fairly easy to set up. Okay, error messages per minute. This is going to be a similar thing. It's just going to be looking for some particular string, and it's counting that over time and doing it by interface type. Nothing much to see here. Yeah, the top 5, it's the same situation as the previous one. So I'll not fix those right now. For active users, I think there was something slightly interesting here. So in this case, we're counting over time for this particular interface where there's some user mentioned in the labels. We don't really want to add these up because you're not interested in how many log lines a user wrote. You're interested in how many users you have. So, this is going to be counted by user, and then it's going to be raised to the power of 0. So if you've got something, it's going to get turned into a 1. So for some user, it's going to output a 1. And it all gets summed up. So now you have a nice thing that tells you, at this time you've got 1 user, at this time you've got 3 users, and, various things like that. There's a bunch more config you can do with queries. There's a bunch of operators, a bunch of functions. So, yeah, if you can think of a use case, chances are you can already do that. What else? And here we've got some parsing of log files after you've ingested it. So I think, based on that regex, you kind of know that the log files are very, very long and into the distance. And the idea is you've got to this point, you're going to want to look at some log files for some particular point in time, for some particular request ID, user, whatever you can think of. But you don't necessarily want to see all the metadata on every single line. So this is what this is doing. It's going to be outputting logs. It's using a selector for client type of web speed, the interface type we gave it, and then we're just going to be using patterns to split up the log lines into manageable tokens. I'll not go through all of them, but yeah. It's similar to regex, and it's a lot easier to use. You don't have to account for everything. But the idea is we've split it into tokens, and then we just want to change the line format. So we only include the timestamp, the program name, and then the message text, which in this case, it's everything after the program name to the end of the line. And it's fairly simple to set up. And here's where those variables you can set on a per dashboard basis. You can include some search fields that people can use to go to logs. So something like the IP address, you're going to be able to use an IP address variable somewhere to check that the label equals that. So again, simple to set up, simple to use, nice to have. Now, in terms of how you're going to get to your own dashboard, just go to dashboards, save this changes. And you want to add a new one. And it's going to ask you if you're building a library. So essentially, all kinds of panels you're going to be using throughout your different dashboards. You can just create a library where you keep all of those, and you're going to have to change only one spot. But yeah, it lets you import the dashboard. So this is where the pre-made ones come in. If you're using some kind of application and it's got its own, you can just import that, and you're going to be good to go. Otherwise, you can just add a visualization, select your data source. So in this case, let's go for the metrics we've got in Prometheus. And I think it was request total number. And yeah, if you want, you can just run query. And it's going to give you the total number of requests, but this time it's going to be split into all of those streams depending on the labels you have. So you're probably going to want to do something different. In this case, we're again looking for the increase in the total number of requests over the range of time you selected at the top of the chart. And you're gonna be interested in this by what? Interface type. And if we run this again now, it's going to error out because I'm doing something badly. This is a nice place to be in, yeah. So this comma is the problem. Okay, so now I think I'm still doing something badly because it's not supposed to be going up and up. So yeah, something is wrong somewhere. I think. I think I'm just not supposed to sum. Count maybe. Again, you can see how familiar I am with this, but oh yeah, because I'm doing this weird thing again where I'm using the range, and it's using the last 6 hours. That's why the data looks all kinds of weird, because it's over the last 6 hours how much it increased. Well, I mean, obviously it's going to increase by a lot because it's all of 6 hours. It's not just going to be that little bit of time, 5 minutes or something. So just a second. I think it's going to be easier because I prepared for a demo where I was going to break everything and not get anything right. So I've got some examples already in place. But yeah, dashboard created. Now it's not the right data, but it's there. And which one was it? This one, new dashboard with a great name. And this one's using metrics, and this one's doing things the right way, so you can see the number of requests based on that metric. And what was I doing badly before? Yeah, I was giving it the range instead of just giving it the interval. So now that it has, the proper 1 minute thing, it's going to give you the right number of requests per interface type, and all of it's just going to work. I'm kind of running out of time, so I'll quickly go over, what you're going to be doing for data. Connect data. It's going to give you a bunch of options of what kind of thing you're connecting to. So pick one, open telemetry, for example. Don't have anything set up right now, but yeah, it's going to ask you for the info it needs. You give all of that here, you do whatever config you need to do locally, and you're good to go. You're just going to start having that available for any kind of queries you're going to be running. Then there's one part that's really nice. It's going to be alerts. You've got your app. You have things set up the way you want it. You've got some standards. So, if the memory goes over 95%, maybe there's something wrong, so you want to send an alert off to someone. So you can just create alert rules. You can do this for a particular chart you created previously. But it's, again, fairly simple. In this case, I've got an alert that just sends me an email when I have too many requests, and it's deliberately set too low and for a very big period of time. So I just get an email on it. If I go back to, dashboard. Okay, request per minute. I'm going to go to edit this, and you're going to be allowed to, create an alert based on this. Okay, why won't it click? Create an alert. Okay, now this is my daily that's starting for a project. The alert rule, it's going to pick up the query you had for that particular chart. Next, you're going to have to give it some kind of condition based on which it's going to alert. So, for all of that data, I'll just pick the max value in terms of number of requests. And if it's going to be above 10, I'm going to get a nice message. Where do you want to store this? The evaluation group, a bunch of settings on here, but towards the end, you're going to be able to select how you want to get notified. So in this case, it's just going to be the default where it sends me a message, but you can integrate this so it sends something off into a Teams channel or anywhere else. Essentially, it has a bunch of integrations, but you can just save this and. Yeah, it's not evaluated yet, but if you go over it, you can see it's pending. On WebTrack, it looks kind of fine because it doesn't have a bunch of requests, but in here, it's going to have more for RecTrack. So at some point, it's going to send an email over telling me that this is an issue that I need to look at. And you can configure this any way you want that makes sense for your application. And yeah, you're going to get a bunch of spam messages if you're not doing it right. So make sure it's not, every 10 seconds get a new email. I think this is about it for the demo now. I think we can just, I'll open up the presentation again, but it's not going to do a lot. Where's the slides? It's essentially Q&A time. So if there's anything, just ask, and yeah, I'll see if I can answer things. Nothing, no one. Is anyone interested in setting something like this up at least?
Do you have something regarding the agent block from the password?
The what?
The agent block from the password.
No, but it's essentially the same thing, right? Because it's going to parse whatever log file you give it, and you can decide what you want to do with it. So it's not really limited in terms of that. I mean, if there's a standard format that's used, so for something like the brokers, it's probably going to be somewhere on the internet at some point, so it's easy to parse whatever, progress outputs in its logs. But right now, as far as I'm aware, you're just going to have to configure everything. It's, just the regex that goes into the distance. Okay, if there's nothing else, thank you for coming, and hopefully this is going to be useful for some people.